Hey everyone, and welcome to the third lesson in our Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde GCSE revision series. If you haven't seen the first couple of episodes, we've been doing character analyses. We did Dr. Jekyll in the first week, we did Mr. Utterson in the second week. We've been doing lots of key quotes, linking it to context, and even some model paragraphs. So if you haven't checked those videos out, I highly recommend it. Today, we are going to be going through Mr. Hyde. We've got a couple more character analysis lessons, and then we're going to start looking at some of the major themes after that, and then we're going to be doing more model paragraphs and answers and taking extracts and all of that good stuff. But today is going to be Mr. Hyde. So kickstarting straight off with Mr. Hyde, as usual, we'll talk a little bit about the character first and what they represent and that sort of thing, and then we're going to move into some key quotes together, and then we'll finish with a model paragraph. So he's what we call a static antagonist. What that means is, so there are two types of characters. I've sort of mentioned this before. There are two ways you could categorize characters. There's static and there's dynamic. So dynamic means that they actually change based on what happens to them in the story and generally. Static means that they don't change no matter what happens to them. So Hyde is static. He is an embodiment of evil, and he doesn't get any better or really any worse. He's pretty much the worst thing you could imagine from the beginning, okay? And obviously he's an antagonist, which is just a fancy word for he is the villain. He's an interesting villain because he's obviously part of, I wouldn't say the hero exactly, but part of one of the, the good characters, so to speak, Dr. Jekyll. So it's quite interesting that he's sort of this mysterious antagonist in the shadows. We don't really get to know much about him. And then it turns out it literally was one of the other characters or inside. And that links to Sigmund Freud. I think I sort of mentioned this also briefly before. Freud believed that we could be broken down as human beings to some extent into three parts of our psychology. We'd have the id, which is our instincts, the ego, which is our reality, our kind of day-to-day consciousness, and then the superego, which is like the best, most moral part of us. So Mr. Hyde clearly represents the id. He's the kind of instinctive part. He's the part of us that probably we don't really want to face sometimes, the part that wants to do the worst stuff. And then we try and balance that out. There's the classic cartoon, right, of like the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. They're just both trying to talk to you to convince you what to do. It's kind of like that, really. Dr. Jekyll is the ego, as we've spoken about before. Hyde is the id. And Utterson is arguably the superego. Okay, so he's a static antagonist. He clearly represents immorality, and as I just said, the id. So in terms of representing immorality, think about everything that Mr. Hyde does in the novella. He tramples on a little girl. He goes out sort of drinking, possibly drugs. We don't even know, womanizing, all that kind of thing, but just generally being a really bad person, choosing to do really bad things. He then obviously kills Sir Danvers Carew, who is, one of the victims of the novella, and he doesn't just kill him; he brutally murders him in the middle of the night for nothing. Seems to be very unprovoked. So he clearly represents immorality and murderous intentions and all kinds of evil. Basically, you could say that he's sort of the dark underbelly of Victorian society. So a lot of Victorian gentlemen would have had these addictions and habits and vices, but you wouldn't have really known about it or talked too much about it in Victorian society, because obviously a Victorian gentleman, his entire life was based upon his reputation, effectively. And it's interesting because Mr. Hyde doesn't really care about this, but Dr. Jekyll clearly does. So when Mr. Hyde tramples on the little girl, Mr. Enfield and the doctor make sure that he pays the little girl's family £100, which I looked up, probably about £6,000 to £10,000 in today's money. So quite a decent chunk of money to keep them quiet, to stop them from what they say is causing a stink about his name across London. So, the reputation of these men was very important, and any of these gentlemen could basically have destroyed any of the others by just spreading information about bad things they had done. Mr. Hyde doesn't care about this, but Dr. Jekyll does. He's linked clearly to alcoholism and drugs as well. I mean, think about Mr. Hyde for a minute. Literally, Dr. Jekyll takes a funny colored potion and turns into a monster, right? It clearly links to alcoholism because, if you drink too much alcohol, your inhibitions are lowered. You might do things that you wouldn't normally do, say things that you wouldn't normally say. Ditto on certain drugs. One of the interesting ones I wanted to quickly mention is cocaine. So when Robert Louis Stevenson was writing this novella, he wrote it in like 3 days, by the way, which is pretty incredible. He was likely on cocaine. The reason for that is because in the 1800s, cocaine was often used medicinally to help people with their pain management, to help people with certain blood disorders. And Robert Louis Stevenson had tuberculosis. At that time, tuberculosis was a death sentence. There was no surviving tuberculosis or TB. So yes, there's a good chance that he was on medicinal cocaine and therefore having those highs that cocaine give. And that may have inspired part of Mr. Hyde's character, the fact that perhaps if he took this drug medicinally, he actually would feel these rushes and thrills the way that Dr. Jekyll describes it. And that's the other thing I would say about Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde is clearly addictive. He's clearly an addictive person, or an addictive thing to be. So Dr. Jekyll is addicted to being Mr. Hyde. There's no doubt about that. So yeah, that's Mr. Hyde in a nutshell, basically. And then I suppose the last thing I'll say is that he kind of murders himself, but also suicide, because at the end, it's all become too much. He doesn't care about Dr. Jekyll at all, but he can't sort of be without Dr. Jekyll because he sort of lives within Dr. Jekyll. So it's a very interesting psychological sci-fi kind of monster horror gothic situation that we find ourselves with Mr. Hyde. All right, so let's dive into some quotes. I've got loads of quotes for Mr. Hyde. We'll try and get through as many as we can. So once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights, he smote her and fled. It should be and fled. Or actually, no, it might not be. Smote her in the face, that's right. And she fled. Yes, that was getting in my way. So interesting use of the word smote. Smote is a very aggressive verb choice. It's actually kind of biblical to some extent. And the idea that he's like smacking this woman in the face is awful, and unprovoked as well. Yeah, unprovoked, really. It seemed like he might even have been being given something by this woman. She's offering him a match or a box of lights or something, and yet he just smacks her in the face. So this is his aggression. The reason I like this quote is because it's a little bit less common. The quote about trampling on the little girl calmly, which we will also talk about, this is an oxymoron. This is much more common. There's nothing wrong with using this quote, especially if you can remember it well, but it's very, very common. Whereas the one about the woman offering a box of lights and he smote her in the face, if you just remember that bit even, then that's much less common. And as you're writing your GCSE answers, you want to try and use quotes that are less common if you can, because the less common quotes are going to at least sort of low key get you more marks because of the fact that it's more impressive, basically, because everyone sort of will have revised this quote, but not many people will have revised or remembered this quote. It shows a deeper knowledge of the novella. The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. So this is when Mr. Hyde meets Utterson, or Mr. Utterson meets Hyde, however you want to look at it. So the snarling is like savage imagery, and it's a animalistic verb choice. You've also got the savage laugh as well, so that's sort of repeating this even further. And the extraordinary quickness. The other thing about Mr. Hyde I probably should have mentioned in here is that there is a sense of the supernatural, because of course he is a supernatural being in some sense. He's not real, he's sort of a fictional idea. So the fact that he has extraordinary quickness, it again adds to this sort of legendary, mythical status, supernatural status of the character. And obviously the door, this is not specifically Hyde, but the door sort of represents Hyde because Hyde is constantly shadowed in secrecy. And so the fact that there's this door that he sort of disappears into and it's locked and it's, this is a motif in the novella, these locked doors, the locked cabinet door, this door, yeah. I never saw a man I disliked, and yet I scarce know why. So this again, it's like paradoxical, and this seems to be the way that everyone feels about Mr. Hyde. The reason for that is because there is something supernatural about him. Whenever anyone talks about Mr. Hyde, they always talk about him in terms of like, I just didn't like him, but I couldn't tell you why I didn't like him. And so that then gets into the supernatural, the spiritual, this idea that he represents that dark, deep evil within us. So even though there was no reason to see that in Mr. Hyde, you could almost like feel it. And I think a lot of us have probably bumped into people, both good and bad, like that, right? There are people where when you're in their presence, you just feel good. They just make you happy. They're just nice. They're just, you just want to be hanging out with them. And then probably you've also bumped into some people that you're like, there's just something not quite right with this person. I don't know what it is. I couldn't tell you, but they just give me the creeps, or they're just not my people, right? And I think that's what it's talking about with Mr. Hyde, this idea that everyone who meets him just kind of instinctively knows that there's something a bit wrong with him. The fact that he tramples calmly on the little girl, it's an oxymoron, but this also highlights the abnormality and immorality of Mr. Hyde. Because Mr. Hyde, if you trampled on someone by accident, you would feel terrible about it. You wouldn't be calm about it. You would be mortified if you are not a psychopath, right? If you're not a bad person, you would be feeling terrible about this. And the fact that it's a little girl as well, the fact that she's so vulnerable makes it even worse. And then he kills Sir Danvers Carew, and Sir Danvers is an older gentleman. So again, there's this vulnerability in older people and younger people. We feel even more a sense of outrage because it's a little girl that he is hurting and trampling on and not even caring about. Another one, sort of bonus one here, talks about he was like a damned juggernaut. Now, what's interesting about that word juggernaut is it actually comes from sort of Indian tradition. And there were followers, worshippers of certain Hindu gods who, if they saw the carriage of what they believed their god was coming through the streets, or representation of that, they would throw their bodies in the way of the carriage to try and slow it down. And so this is an image of throwing a body under a large object. You've probably heard that word juggernaut before. It's normally like this big force, basically. And so the fact that Hyde's a little man, but he's described as being this big force, also adds to the supernatural, and it adds to his evil. And then there's all the animalistic, I said about animalistic imagery that is used with him. He's described as an ape-like fury. This is when he's killing Sir Danvers Carew. So the ape-like fury, again, animalistic imagery, and it's a metaphor as well with ape-like fury. So again, you can imagine this kind of lack of humanity in Mr. Hyde, effectively, that he's more like an animal than a man, as he attacks this Sir Danvers Carew, this innocent victim who's just seemed to have been asking Mr. Hyde the way somewhere, and he just clubs him to the earth and kills him. And that's the reaction of a lot of the other characters. So Utterson says, God bless me, the man seems hardly human, something troglodytic, shall we say. So this is symbolism of caveman. So a troglodyte was seen to be an ancestor of human beings, not actually, Homo sapiens like we are, but a basic, more caveman-like version of a human being pre-Homo sapiens. So that one there, animalistic, caveman, evil, all links to the id, right? All links to what I said about the id. All right, we've got some more. I don't know if we'll get through all of these before our model, but we'll do our best. So at the beginning, Hyde is described as being like a stain upon the mirror. And at the end, Dr. Jekyll says, my devil had been long caged. He came out roaring. I'm actually going to put these together. So these are really interesting quotes because they show Hyde's growing power. Now, he's a static character, but the power that he has within the novel does grow. So at the beginning, the simile of like a stain upon a mirror, if you breathe on glass or you breathe on a mirror, you know how it like steams up a little bit, but then you can just wipe it away and it's gone. Whereas so that's how Dr. Jekyll sees Mr. Hyde at the beginning. But then at the end, his devil is long caged. He can't get rid of Mr. Hyde anymore, so he just has to put Mr. Hyde in a cage. So I did talk about this when we were talking about Dr. Jekyll as well, in terms of his addiction to Mr. Hyde and his losing control of Hyde. But here we go. Mr. Hyde grows in power in the same way. So the fact he's caged at the end, it more gives a sense of threat, because the fact he's in a cage suggests at some moment he could potentially escape and break out and cause problems. And that's exactly what happens, obviously. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. Need to move this up a little bit again. So this one is juxtaposition. And what's cool about this quote is you've got these two, it's also what we call a dichotomy. So you've got these two, this division and this split between the two characters. So Jekyll, a father's interest. Normally fathers are pretty interested in their sons, you know, they try and get involved with their son's life and so on and so on. Many of you are going to be teenagers, and so you know that a son or daughter's indifference, it links to this fact that at some point in your teenage years, quite often you'll try and separate yourself from your family a little bit, or many of us as teenagers feel a little embarrassed of our parents in certain moments, stuff like that. So Hyde is like the cool kid, basically. He doesn't want anything to do with Jekyll, even though Jekyll is constantly pursuing Hyde. And when you think about that quote, that shows exactly why it ends up the way it does, because Dr. Jekyll is pursuing Mr. Hyde all the time, whereas Mr. Hyde doesn't want anything to do with Dr. Jekyll. So who has the power in this division? Mr. Hyde really has the power, right? At the end, Mr. Utterson, or end of chapter 8, Mr. Utterson obviously remarks that he's looking at the body of a self-destroyer, and he's looking at Mr. Hyde twitching on the ground, right? Because he's just taken a triple shot of the potion to try and turn back to Dr. Jekyll. It's Dr. Jekyll trying to get back from Mr. Hyde. But what's interesting about this quote is it is also sort of symbolic, and it's maybe even, you could call it Mr. Hyde's hamartia to some extent, his fatal flaw. If I don't know if I would 100% say Mr. Hyde is a dynamic, well, he's not a dynamic character, but a developed enough character to have a hamartia exactly. Some of you might have seen that said as hamartia. But his fatal flaw potentially is his self-destructive nature, right? That there is no boundary to Mr. Hyde. You can't live like that in the real world. You can't just do whatever you want all the time, including every impulse that you have, because it ends up really messy, like with Mr. Hyde. Evil, I fear, founded. Evil was sure to come of that connection. I believe you. I believe poor Harry is killed, and I believe his murderer, for what purpose God alone can tell, is still lurking in his victim's room. Now, it's a very long quote. I don't expect you to remember all of this, but the repetition of evil, 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 yeah? And the fact that Utterson at the end comes to the conclusion that he believes Mr. Hyde has killed Dr. Jekyll, this shows just how bad Mr. Hyde is, because Mr. Utterson is someone who's very logical and calm and steady. And so for him to be like, yeah, I think, and he's a lawyer, so, you know, it's innocent till proven guilty. But in this section, when he actually does believe that Mr. Hyde has killed Dr. Jekyll, we see just how evil Mr. Hyde must be, that even a lawyer and a objective person who's in the justice system basically is like, yeah, I just think this dude is guilty. I saw the sawbones turn sick and white with desire to kill him. This one is ironic, or irony, because what we have here is a sawbones is a doctor wanting to kill their patient. Yeah. So again, it links to what I've already said, the fact that anyone who meets Mr. Hyde has just this deep dislike, this almost supernatural urge to get away from him or even to kill him. That just shows how horrible Mr. Hyde is and how you just don't want anything to do with him. So that's a really good quote there. The irony of that is quite interesting. There are several other quotes where I think you would have to double check this, but I believe it's Wilder's harpies when talking about the women trying to kill and grab Mr. Hyde. This is after the little girl's been trampled on, so it's at sort of end of chapter 1. But I believe that the women were described as wild as harpies trying to grab and kill Mr. Hyde or hurt him. So again, everyone who meets him has this deep dislike of him. Okay, so in terms of a model paragraph, which I've actually given myself a bit more time today, which I'm proud of myself on. Like normal, what we want to do is we want to do point, evidence, technique, explain, explanation, reader response, I'm just going to put RR because I just said reader response, so that's what that RR means. And then potentially context, depending on your exam board. Double check your exam board if you need context. Just remember, you can talk about the things I've already said about Stevenson having tuberculosis, facing death, knowing about the kind of dark underbelly of the Victorian gentleman scene, potentially the medicinal cocaine and you know, having drunk alcohol, understanding that alcohol can lead to these lowerings of inhibitions, and perhaps even linking to Sigmund Freud and the id, the ego, and the superego. We're just going to do, for Mr. Hyde, a few points that you might raise if the question was something like, how is Mr. Hyde presented? I do this same sort of question for every character to keep it nice and broad. Some of the points that we could do, as I said at the beginning, is, you know, he's presented as a static antagonist, he represents immorality, he represents the dark underbelly of Victorian society, he represents addiction, he represents the supernatural. I think for me today, I'm just going to keep it fairly simple. I'm going to go with that he represents immorality. Okay, so let's get going. One of the ways that Stevenson presents Mr. Hyde in the novella, I have a feeling there's going to be more typos than normal today, so I apologize. One of the ways that Stevenson presents Mr. Hyde in the novella is as a deeply immoral character. So you always want to start with a clear point of what you're going to talk about. You see this in the quote. Which quote shall we do today, boys and girls? I'm thinking that we will do trampled calm. No, sorry, he smote her in the face. Let's do an uncommon one first. He smote her in the face. Speaking of a woman who was trying to offer him, probably don't need underlining, do I really? Let's just take that out for a second. There we go. The verb choice smote is extremely aggressive and even has some biblical connotations to it, suggesting that the extreme power which Hyde puts behind his hitting of the woman. The fact that he is willing to fully commit to harming someone innocent shows psychopathy and immorality to the extreme. So that's the first bit. I'm gonna, because we have time, I'll do a bonus second quote. So furthermore, when he trampled calmly on the little girl, the use of the oxymoron shows how Mr. Hyde's lack of morality or conforming to social standards, it is obvious. If anyone with normal morality trampled on someone, they would not be calm. As the reader, this further deepens our dislike and mistrust of the character and establishes him as the antagonist. This is significant because when Stevenson wrote this, he was aware of the work of Sigmund Freud, who believed in the id, a part of humanity or human psychology was fully committed to following impulse regardless of social or regardless of the law, let's say. So something like that. Now, the only other thing is you could put the late 19th century. Try and make your context a little bit more specific. I was rushing there. All right, so there's a model paragraph on Mr. Hyde. You can use that as the basis of a paragraph for yourself if he comes up in the exam, which there's a pretty good chance he will. So if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments, please comment below, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks very much.